Hello everyone. Today we are going to do a video on how to do a mini research project and what to do when you're preparing for a presentation. I'm going to give a talk today to a couple of students on justice, the philosophical topic of justice, and I'm going to share with you how I would go about doing this in a simple way. If I don't have too much time, and I don't need to go too deep into the topic. So this might be ideal if you're making a 10, 15 minute, maybe 20-minute long classroom presentation, or if you're preparing for a very easy, not too high resolution teaching task, like maybe you're talking about an academic topic to high school students or junior high school students. So what you should first do is to have a look at some resources. If you're talking about philosophy, then one good way to do this is to try one of two very effective and trusted sources. One of them is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can search the SEP and SCP. They have entries on thousands of important topics in philosophy. And of course, they have a very detailed entry on justice. If you check this, this would translate into something that you would read in probably about 2 hours, even if it would just be a normal text. But of course, it's a philosophical text, so count maybe 3 hours easily for reading the whole entry. The other similar entry is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And this is also a very good website. The SEP, as its name suggests, is edited and generated in the US, and the IEP, I think, in Britain. And you have then a general review of Western theories of justice. The good thing about these encyclopedias is that usually they recommend you related entries. You can easily look around for other entries on justice. And you can look at distributive justice as well here on the IEP. And on the SEP on the bottom, you can see the related entries. You can look at justice as a virtue, distributive justice, global justice, intergenerational justice, international distributive justice, retributive justice, transitional justice, and so on and so on, a couple of other connected topics. And it also links to the justice courses by Michael Sandel, who's a brilliant Harvard professor, and some other useful things. Of course, at the end, if you're looking for reading, something that you can read to go into more detail, or you can recommend to your students, these entries always have detailed bibliography, and they make references in the text to the entries, so you can easily follow up where certain ideas discussed in more detail or where it's coming from. You can recommend something to your students or look something up yourself. Now, another thing that's useful to do is to make some notes, right? So we want to do something like the following. It's 2022, it's 3:15 today. So we're taking some notes on justice, and we can save this and get about our job. Now, what is a good way of getting going here? Well, one thing you can do first is check out the table of contents, right? So if you look at the IEP, you will see immediately that it starts, it has a historical approach. It's going to look at ancient Greece first and the two main authors, Plato and Aristotle. Then it goes into medieval Christianity, Augustine and Aquinas. Augustine is one of the, most important people in the history of the church, in that sense that he managed to help organize the church much better than it was before, and to philosophically solidify the teachings of the church in a way that satisfied the demands of educated audiences as well. Up to that point, much of Christianity consisted of different kinds of books re-edited and edited, and it was becoming very popular around the Mediterranean. We were talking about 6th, 5th, 6th century, but it was still lacking in, well, working out its modern form, let's just say so. Aquinas is, of course, the one of the leading scholastics from the 13th century, and he is the one who has brought Aristotle's influence into the church. Up to that point, Augustine is more of a Platonic author. And then you have the early modernity, Hobbes, Hume, recent modernity, you could say also 18th, 19th century Enlightenment, Kant and Mill, and then 20th century Rawls and post-Rawls. So this entry is nice. If you would want to say something on the basis of it, you could mention these people. I would do that maybe in a high school context, but of course, if you're teaching at university level or if you're teaching adults, it's sort of obvious that such a topic is going to have a very rich history. So you don't need to, reproduce these. If you look at justice here on the SEP, this is going to be more of a conceptual, a little bit more philosophical, less historical approach. And it's going to first map the concept. What does that mean? Well, obviously the concept justice has many different conceptions, many different ways in which people think about what they're talking about when they're talking about justice. So you see that you can talk about individual claims, right? What does someone deserve? Let's say you do your job, you deserve your salary, or you deserve a share of the product, you deserve a share of the company, you deserve a share of something. You deserve your reward. Justice, charity, and enforceable obligation, right? If we have rights, we also have obligations and duties. And society, any community, this should be so. Charity is a very interesting thing. Do we deserve the help of others? What does justice say about these things? Impartiality. Justice is obviously connected to impartiality because the demands of justice are supposed to be independent of vested interests and subjective perspectives. Justice and agency. It's going to be very interesting. I wonder what this entry is about. And then this entry makes 4 distinctions: conservative versus ideal justice, distributive and corrective justice. So corrective is obviously punishment, retribution, right? We do need to discuss justice when it comes to people committing crimes. They're doing something that's not allowed by law. Say my neighbor builds a shed on their property, but it takes up too much space and it's in a location that they would have had to ask for permission. They never did. So my neighbor probably has to destroy their shed or rebuild it in a different place. That might be an issue of justice. But of course, a more prominent issue of corrective justice will be when somebody commits a crime, wrongs someone else, harms someone else in a serious way. For example, when they steal, rob, lie, trick, fraud, when they're corrupt. You can think of public officials stealing money, or companies creating market circumstances in which workers don't have a chance, their employees don't have a chance to really negotiate their wages. They just have to accept the job. These are all cases where corrective justice can be invoked. Distributive justice is about what kind of methods of distribution are just, right? We can distribute what we have in society and what we produce in many, many different ways. At the moment, distributions are very unequal in most societies, and it's probably not right. So we need to improve the mechanisms of distribution, but they are not the same question as corrective justice. Procedural and substantive justice as well. You might think of procedural justice as the way in which people in procedures are conducted. So, for example, a legal case has to be discussed by impartial judges. Everyone should have the right to have a lawyer who is an expert in law and represent their legal interests, and so on and so on. These are procedural questions. And substantive justice is more about what is really just, right? What kind of society do we want, or what kind of standards does a just leader have to live up to? So it's a stronger normative component. It's not just about saying, oh, if we have a transparent voting process, that's one element of justice. It's also about if we have a transparent voting process, but we live in a dictatorship, that's not going to be just, no matter how transparent it is. It might be procedurally just, more just than a secret decision procedure, but substantially it's not just. And we can look at comparative versus non-comparative justice. That's also an interesting question here. Scope of justice. What kind of relations, individuals, institutions, living beings, creatures, justice extends to, is different if justice is about recognition, recognizing someone's effort, and it's different when it's about redistribution, like taxation. Or you can also think about redistribution when you do a job for a company. Obviously, you did the job. You should be the one who gets all the profits for that money. But some of your money is going to be redistributed within the company, right? Some of it goes to the bosses. Some of it goes to the shareholders. Some of it goes to your colleagues. Some of it goes to many different people who are basically taking away money from you. Why is that kind of redistribution just? What ways are just? Is it ever just? How is it just? And so on and so on. And then there's a little bit about 20th century, it's relatively recent. These are all Gautier, Rawls, and Scanlon are three philosophers who have been working since the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and are very prominent in the US. And then we have egalitarianism and justice. So the connection between equality, different notions of equality, right? There's equality of chance. Everyone has the chance to compete under the same circumstances. There's equality of starting position, that everyone has access to the same goods when they start in a competition. Like everyone should have access to good schooling, everyone should have access to good healthcare, everyone should have access to a safe home, enough food, shelter, and so on. Without these things, of course, we can't talk equality. But there are more substantial notions of equality as well, like say anyone who is willing to do any kind of job, and not just paid work, but caring jobs, taking care of family, care tasks, feeding their family, clothing their family, and so on, should be entitled to certain quality of life, and so on and so on. So these are all interesting. Responsibility sensitive egalitarianism is going to say that sure, everyone should have a decent minimum, but people who take more responsibility should maybe have a little bit more. These are all interesting things. And responsibility sensitive egalitarianism is probably going to favor, that's my intuitive understanding, people who work in caring jobs, doctors, social workers, teachers, police officers, judges, because they have a very big responsibility. Someone who works in marketing, sales in a company, working at new business products, some kind of managerial position, they have a responsibility to their company, but ultimately nobody's lives depends, nobody's education depends on them, so they don't have substantial amounts of responsibility like a judge, a doctor, a parent, a carer. Right, so you see there is a big difference between the two kinds of approaches. My students who I'm going to talk to today are mature students, and they usually prefer to have an interesting question. They like to hear a little bit about the history as well. You can do a mix of the two topics. So one way to go about this would be to highlight some interesting tidbits from the history and discuss, okay, how is this different from what we have today? But I don't have so much time with them. This is going to be a relatively short class, only 50 minutes, and my students are not native speakers of English, so they like to have 5-10 minutes as warm up and cool down when we just chat about their life, maybe a movie they have seen recently, maybe some good music they have listened to, maybe an exhibition they have visited or something similar. So I don't think I want too much filler content. If I don't want too much filler content, then what is important philosophically would be to map the concept of it. This is always important, and if you read any kind of philosophical work, you will be like, oh, okay, I'll get to know what justice is. And then the work goes on for 20 pages, and it's going to say things like, oh, maybe this is justice, maybe that is justice, this is not justice. Some cases of using justice in this way do seem to pick out what we mean by justice and so on and so on. So this is when you're really narrowing down from all the many, many, many different ways in which someone could think about justice, what you mean, or what the philosopher whose work you're reading means by justice in that treatment of the subject. And if you do a philosophy presentation or you write a philosophy paper, essay, submission, anything, you need to do this work, because in philosophy, as in mathematics, our tools are purely conceptual. Right? We can't show you the object justice as a geographer can, that, yeah, I can't describe this rock in more detail, but this is the rock, right? And then you can study it with different methods. We don't have that luxury in philosophy, so we need to be very, very careful and precise about what topic we are actually looking at. So that's a thing we definitely want to be doing. And one way to be doing that is how many different ways of thinking about justice are there. So this could be a first phrasing of a question, but this is not a very good question. I would want to rephrase this, because there are many, many different ways, right? And you can think here, oh, well, maybe in the 15th century in the Philippines, people thought in a certain way about what is social justice. But that's not what I'm interested in, right? So what I would be interested in here is something more narrow and something a little bit more philosophical. And that would be, what conceptions of justice are there? So conceptions of justice, we need to help our students to narrow down. So when we think about what is the right of taxation and what is the right jail time for a criminal, we using the same conception of justice. And this can help us to distinguish between distributive and retributive justice. And this is one of the basic distinctions if you get to the topic of justice. This kind of distinction is certainly something we want to do. Now, as you see, I'm sort of mapping the concept and the four distinctions together because, as I said, it's a shorter class and my students are not experts in philosophy or philosophy majors, so we don't need to do and spend a lot of time on mapping the concept. I think this is very useful for professional philosophers, and if you're a philosophy student at, say, a little bit more advanced BA or MA or PhD level, definitely this is one of the most important sections of the article. The rest is something that you should be able to figure out if you read good source works. But with my mature students, I think I can straight away go to the more particular distinctions here. So we can sort of scour and quickly go through what's going on here, and we can look at the first 1-2 topics. These entries are usually very, very well edited, so the first couple of sentences are going to tell you what the paragraph and the section is about, right? So here we see that the first section is going to try to distinguish justice and rightness, right? Which is very interesting. In some way, rightness and justice do seem to be two concepts which are very close to each other, but it's a little bit more particular. is rightness is going to be what is the right thing to do in general. There's a sense of just, right? We say the just person does the right thing always. But this is a bit different. And one of the maybe ways in which people have tried to narrow it down is that justice is, it has to more to do with what people deserve. People deserve, not simply what is right. It is a narrower concept than right. So we have this, which is a nice point, right? It doesn't mean exactly the same as right. Each his due. Now, if you know the notion of deserve, due, it can mean many kinds of things, right? Criminal deserves punishment. Someone who does a job deserves their salary. Someone who helps others deserves praise, and so on. Someone who is mean deserves blame. So this is an interesting thing. And we can look at whether justice is the kind of thing, whether this kind of notion of impartial deserves is about what is due to people. And we can ask one question: what is due to a criminal? Or maybe what does a criminal deserve? If you want some questions, and our students will be able to answer this. And so on. So we can look at some of these questions with our students, right? And then probably we want to make maybe this section 1, concepts of justice, and we can make maybe this section 2, distinctions, conceptions of justice, maybe. All conceptions relate to the same concepts, but they cover something a little bit different. It's an interesting question. Does justice have our relations? No. So the family topic is interesting, right? Justice and family. Do we have to be just in family, friendship, and love? Or are these relationships different? Is justice only about public relationships, employer and employee, citizen state, say, and so on and so on. What kind of public relationships are there? Citizen, organization, state, and so on. Or also about personal relationships, right? That's the question here. Should the two kinds of relationship be marked by the same kind of thing? We are going to insert page numbers, but yeah, like that. Good. We can nevertheless make it visible in this way. Good. And if my student, I'll send the notes always to the students after classes. So if they want to check something, they can just change the format to whatever they like. So as you see, you don't need to go into each section and each paragraph in a lot of detail if you have a reasonable idea about what is going on. Obviously, I've read this entry and I've read a good deal about justice already. I've been doing philosophy for a long, long time. So you might need to do a bit more background reading, but obviously if you teach these topics or if you give a presentation, that's going to be expected of you. But once you have done your reading and you talked about it a little bit, you're going to be able to relatively quickly and effectively use these resources, this kind of encyclopedia entries, to draw out some reasonable drafts on how to get going with discussion and how to get going with the topic. In this case, I would probably aim for, I'm going to have about, as I said, 50 minutes in total, but 10 minutes are probably going to be used for the warm-up and cool-down. So I'll have about 40 minutes. So I would probably try to give my students about 20 minutes so that to talk, to discuss, to ask some questions. So I have basically about 20 minutes to talk and present ideas to them. So what I would do, I'm not going to do the whole thing together with you in this video, but what I would want to do, ideally, as you said, as you saw, we are not going to spend too much time on mapping the concept, just a little bit of it to give the students an idea that this is something that they can do in more detail, and then go on to the four distinctions and talk a little bit more about that, maybe spend 5 minutes easily on that. And then I would probably talk about some of the main 20th century ideas. So Rawls is the main author. If you look at justice, that doesn't mean you have to accept everything he says, but he is the reference point for people working today. His book Justice, the idea of justice is from 1971, so it's going to be dated, 51 years old, but it's a very good book and it's an excellent introduction. It discusses a lot of the connected topics. You can start from there, some of the important sections of the book. You don't need to peruse the whole book. And then, look at what has been happening, what is debated more recently. And I think one of the hot topics, simply because economic inequality is so bad and growing, rising very fast, especially in countries like Chile, the United States, Japan, China, major countries, big parts of the world economy. Lots of people live in these countries. I will talk a little bit about the egalitarianism and justice topic. If you're doing philosophy, you don't need to tell the students your own political view, but there's nothing wrong with doing so, right? You might have a certain kind of stance, but what you have to be able to is to accommodate disagreement, reasonable reason disagreement, and you have to be able to accept if your students disagree with you. And it's okay to try and teach them, show them how to debate these topics intelligently, right? So as long as they have good reasons and they're willing to listen to your reasons and change their point or be flexible about it, that's fine. Okay, so much about this. I think this should give you a good idea about how to get started. And if you like this video, if you have any questions, ideas, please do share with me. I'm always happy to read comments and get questions, and I'll try to reply. Have a lovely day. Take care.